I'd like to talk about my experience at the Packard Foundation, which I joined in 2007, really heeding something that Julie Vano said in her talk, that who the funder is makes a big difference in what kind of work gets done. And I went there thinking that would be a great thing to learn how to do. It took me 2 years to get to the stage where I could figure out what to do to make that happen. And in the succeeding 6 years, I made grants of between $3 and $4 million a year, whose main thrust was to try to increase use-inspired research in the communities that we were working with. And the way I did that was to emphasize an approach which I relabeled. This is sort of a private label deal. I called it linking knowledge with action. And the idea was to serve to create the knowledge that would be useful to my colleagues in their 6 different conservation strategies that were in different parts of the world and had different targets. So I had a clientele in the sense, and this is again goes back to the question of who your partners are. I had a clientele of people who were funding other grantees, all working on conservation activities. And I'd like to say a little bit about what I learned and how I stubbed my toe. One of the things that there's a handout there, because before there was PowerPoint, there was paper. And this is from a report that an evaluator and I did in 2012, basically summarizing where we'd gotten to. And I don't want you to read this now, although you might find it interesting to read it later on. This is a checklist that I would use as a template when deciding whether a grant was designed appropriately, and in trying to create the conditions for a successful grant. And you'll notice that the first row talks about strategic alignment, and that is the point is that we would fund knowledge when we thought there was a good case for use and there were users identified. And indeed, it was up to the grantee often to develop who these users were. And then the other conditions, which you'll see in the other rows, they have to do with the conditions that we thought would enhance the likelihood of producing usable knowledge. And part of what I learned over the next several years was that, I think probably the most important lesson is how if you're funding the use of knowledge, your grant is going to end generally before the use has occurred. So whether it actually makes a difference or not is something that you don't get to observe. And at the time that I left last year, I rated about a third of the grants that I had made over the preceding 6 or 7 years as too early to tell in terms of their impact. So that's very important to think about, is that the learning is necessarily slow because what you're supplying is knowledge. But in some cases, we were able to answer questions that the users already knew they had. So one of the projects that I funded quite early on was a scientific synthesis study of what are called emerging contaminants, which are there's 200,000 chemicals that are found in seawater that are of human origin. Whether they're hazardous or not is only partly known. Obviously, from a monitoring standpoint, you can't monitor for all those chemicals coming from the wastewater and so forth. And so we funded a group of ecotoxicologists and risk analysts to try to figure out what a risk-based approach how a risk-based approach would make sense. They then developed something based on experience in the terrestrial world as far as risk analysis was concerned, and experience in the marine world in terms of how to implement this. And that's been adopted now by the State Water Resources Control Board, which is the main regulatory body. It's the state agency that works with the EPA. But that took 3 years to go from a finished study with the Water Resources Board sitting at their table, telling them what was useful until it got to be an enacted regulation. So that's that's a great success, if you like, of bringing knowledge into decision making. But it too was extremely slow. The other thing I want to say, because my time is dwindling, is that a large part of what I learned, I got optimistic enough after about 5 years of this, that I decided that I wanted to think about what it was that I learned in private philanthropy that would be useful in the federal sphere, because after all, the federal funding pot is really the big one in terms of both because of global change science and in the areas that we were concerned with. But as I started to think about this, it occurred to me that philanthropy, the program I was working with was small scale. Even though the Packard Foundation is the 7th largest philanthropy in the United States, a budget of $3 to $4 million is spare change in the federal scheme of things. Our opportunities, the opportunities that I created to make these grants, each one of them was really purpose-built, because I use this protocol that I've handed out to you as a set of design criteria, really, to try to shape the coalitions. And I would try to recruit and shape the grantee and the user population so as to increase the chances of success. This was a very high-touch, grant-by-grant approach, analogous, if you like, to building an Aston Martin, whereas what was going on in the federal arena was building tens of thousands of Corollas. And I couldn't to this day, I actually don't know how to transfer that knowledge, and I'm very interested in thinking about ways of doing that. But on the federal side, agencies have legal mandates. They use RFPs that operate in a very constrained choice environment. And yet, we've seen evidence in the RISAs and elsewhere of the ability to fly under the radar and to really make notable contributions with quite modest, sums of money, and not unlike the one that I was spending. So I want to join that conversation and to remind you that the point of the GIS example was that there was a convergence of incentives from different arenas. There was a profit motive from Esri. There was the motives of the governmental agencies generating georeference data. And there was a motive from academia, because geography was such a steeply declining discipline that universities were disestablishing their geography departments. And the GIS became the way of relegitimating geography as an exciting new intellectual discipline, reviving the whole field, not just the computer jockeys. And in thinking about use-inspired research, we don't have any of those sets of incentives right now. So part of the institutional commitment question that we talked about earlier today has to do with where there are opportunities to begin to take this. There's a lot of high-level commitment to these ideas, but the question is, how do we now translate those into something that will eventually become self-energizing and sustainable on its own? So that's why the $20 million a year for 10 years is a really nice target conceptually to think about, because at the end of it, it goes away. So what could you do with $200 million over a decade? Stop there.
Clarifying questions for
Adam.
You shared this checklist with me before, but I was just struck by, how extensive it was again. But then a question jumped out at me under the life situation category. Are there good prospects that new information would be influential? For example, does the balance between power and knowledge in decision making favor knowledge? Mm-hmm. Should it favor knowledge?
Well, again, this is a lesson that you learn from philanthropy. In philanthropy, there's never enough money to take up all the questions that you should be taking up. Right? So unlike a situation in the water agencies where you have there are problems that are of some urgency. You have to make a decision about a $100 million infrastructure change next year, and you've got to deal with that. I had the luxury of choosing those problems that seemed most ripe. Okay, which is not true of a lot of the, and certainly a lot of federal programs, you don't have that. So what I was trying to do is to figure out, how do I define which fruit is lowest on the tree? And many of these questions, including that one, have to do with this: does it look like a favorable situation in which to work? Because since if it's going to take years after the grant is done to see any feedback, how was I going to know, let alone anybody else, whether what I did was actually going to work?
So is the knowledge right for that specific?
Correct. Correct. But again, I had the luxury, because I was working in the private philanthropy world, of not trying to answer all the questions that I thought were important. I just had to tackle the ones that were feasible. And that's, which is one of the choices that I think we have to make in terms of seeing where the frontier of this is. John?
How did you kind of deal with rotten fruit? In other words, being an arbiter in a sense, did you draw on colleagues to help you when maybe something seemed good but weren't sure? That process of selection.
Yeah, there were a lot of, I mean, I should say that there were a lot of things that failed, okay? So if 1/3 of my grants were too early to tell, about 25% were failures outright. And another, the remainder, whatever that is, just over 1/3 had been successful. And part of what happened was that the teams that I managed to assemble didn't necessarily work well together, all right? So, and I didn't necessarily know that. To give you one example, I funded a project that was going to adapt an existing model taken from one set of wind projects in Northern California and apply them in Southern California. It turned out that the database that they needed to put into that model to make the model work didn't exist and couldn't be measured in, with the resources that we provided. But the grantee, which was a consulting firm, they decided that this was important to use their work on this to get further business. So so I didn't find out till too late in the game that this wasn't going to work for what my purpose was, but it worked just dandy in terms of building their business. Now, were they at fault? I don't think so, because I think that in the grant-making business, the need to work out the ground rules of trust between the grantee and the grant maker are always up for discussion. And I don't think they did anything that I would call unethical, but it's a lesson of how that world really works.